We're going to talk a little bit about the rise of different dictators that we have not talked about yet. We've only really talked about Hitler, and we're going to be talking about what was going on in the United States in the 1930s leading up into this point. All right, so we're going to start with Joseph Stalin. He is the dictator in Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time. And back in World War I, Russia suffers a lot of losses in World War I, and so they're not really prepared to go to war with Germany, in part because they weren't industrialized. Okay, they didn't have the massive amounts of factories. And after their leader, before Stalin, who is Lenin, after Lenin died, Stalin takes over in 1924, and he pushed forward a really fast, massive industrialization plan that would make the Soviet Union into a modern industrial power. And from about 1934 to 1939, this is like right around the same time Hitler comes into power, Stalin starts to do what he calls purifying the Communist Party by getting rid of any of his opponents, any of his political opponents, and anyone who was a threat to him. So in all, Stalin's agents arrested more than 7 million people from all levels of society during 1934 to 1939. About 1 million of those were executed, and millions more ended up in forced labor camps. So labor camps like we have talked about in this class. Nearly all of these people were innocent people. You have next to him, you have Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini had fought in World War I, and he believed that the Treaty of Versailles should have given Italy more land. And Mussolini, he was a writer, a really talented speaker. He begins attracting followers, including angry veterans, opponents of the Italian monarch, and they form what is called the Fascist Party. He relies on what are called the black shirts or the black shirt gangs to terrorize and harass people, anyone who opposes him. And he becomes so powerful that when he threatens to march on Rome, the king makes him the prime minister. And he'll call himself Il Duce, which means the leader. And in the name of order, he suspends elections. He outlaws all other political parties, and he establishes a dictatorship. So his goal is forging a new sort of Roman empire. And in 1935, he invades and conquers Ethiopia in Africa. And we're not going to talk too much about Hitler because we've already spent a lot of time talking about Hitler's rise to power. But just as review, he forms the Nazi Party, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He becomes chancellor. He's the chancellor from 1933 to 1945, and president, dictator. And he's associated with the rise of fascism in Europe. Again, one of his main foreign and domestic policies is that he wanted to seize living space for the Germanic people. Okay, now we're going to move on to talking about a few different invasions that happened that really sparked World War II. So the first is Japan's invasion of Manchuria. So a little bit of background here. Japan was experiencing a population explosion in the 1900s. And by 1930, the population was about 65 million, and it was growing by about 1 million people per year. So it was rapidly booming. And Japan lacked the land and needed to feed its population and the raw materials and markets needed for their economy. So they're going to look to Manchuria, and you can see it highlighted in that map. So here's Japan in red. Manchuria is part of China here. They're going to look for Manchuria as its solution. Manchuria has coal and iron and undeveloped land. So Japan will invade Manchuria and make it a colony of Japan. By 1937, so that happens in 1931. By 1937, Japan will take Beijing, the capital of China. Okay, so you can see here that at this point, the Japanese Empire, it also includes Korea, which borders Manchuria. Okay, and then, so this is Manchuria. They got this in 1931. And if you look here, Japan expands all the way through this portion of China in 1937. So you can see the Japanese Empire was pretty expansive. And the next invasion we're going to talk about is in 1935. Italy invades Abyssinia. And Mussolini, he wanted to forge this new huge Roman Empire. And so he invades Abyssinia, which is modern day Ethiopia. I'm going to click over. Okay, so you can see this is modern day Ethiopia. So that's where we're talking about. This is one of the last independent nations left in Africa at the time. And right after that, Hitler and Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin sign a 10-year non-aggression pact. And that happens between Germany and the Soviet Union. And then in 1939, Hitler invades Poland. The League of Nations at this point is really tested during both invasions and fails. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia, ended, Neville Chamberlain, he's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, his hope of working peacefully, France and Great Britain abandoned this kind of appeasement policy and pledged that if Hitler invaded Poland, they would come to its defense. Hitler doesn't really believe Great Britain and France at this time. And he had one major concern, though, and that was he didn't want to fight a two-front war. If we remember back to World War I, Germany was forced into a two-front war and they lost. So he signs this 10-year-long non-aggression pact with Stalin. And the pact basically divided up the independent states of Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. And then a week after this non-aggression pact, he invades Poland. So again, you probably know what's coming. The Soviet Union will join the Allied powers. So we can kind of see some foreshadowing that at some point Hitler's going to violate this non-aggression pact and cause the Soviet Union to join on the side of the Allies. Okay, now talking about the United States at this point. So the United States, so all of this is going on, right, in Europe in the 1930s. President Roosevelt, we've talked about this in class, President Roosevelt is busy basically trying to lift the United States out of the Depression. And a lot of Americans chose isolationism from Europe. They don't want to know what's going on in Europe. They don't want any involvement with Europe. The memory of World War I is still pretty fresh, and they just didn't want to be involved in another war. So they kind of practice this policy of isolationism or not getting involved. And they passed these different neutrality acts starting in 1935. And this is Congress actually writing laws to prevent international involvement by passing these neutrality acts. So the first of these is passed in 1935, and this banned the United States from providing any sort of weapons to nations that were at war. The second was passed in 1936, and again, this banned any sort of monetary loans to nations at war. And then the third act was passed in 1937, which permitted trade with fighting nations in non-military ways. So they could do trade with them as long as it didn't relate to the military. Also, as long as the nations paid cash for the trades and they transported the cargo themselves. And this policy, the Neutrality Act of 1937, becomes known as cash and carry. The cash part is so that American businesses wouldn't have any influence in getting our government involved in a war because a particular country owed us money. And the carry part was so that the United States didn't have any ships being seized because other countries were at war, and there's always the risk that if you're shipping cargo, a ship could be seized by another country. So these neutrality acts prevented the United States from even selling arms even to nations that are trying to defend themselves from aggression. And by doing this, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he points out later that the neutrality acts actually encouraged aggression. And by 1938, parts of the world are under siege. So the US involvement will grow, and it will become this debate on what is the US's role in this world war. So the late 1930s, again, America is recovering from a depression, and it's finally kind of getting to that point of recovery. It's no longer this 24-hour devotion to the economy. Americans didn't like what they were seeing in Europe as the war progressed, but they also were not willing to get involved. And so 3 weeks after the invasion of Poland, Roosevelt asked Congress to revise those neutrality acts. Congress repealed the arms embargo, so not like loaning arms to other countries, and they started to give Britain and France all the weapons that they needed. And later, another amendment will allow American merchant ships to transport these to Britain. So not only are we allowing them to buy weapons from us, later on, they'll even start transporting those ships, or sorry, those goods. In June of 1940, France, the country of France, falls to the Germans. So Germany overtakes France. And so Britain is really the only country left standing. The US will then send 50 destroyers, a type of boat, to Britain in return for permission to build military bases on British territory. 2 days after that trade, a group of staunch isolationists in the United States form what is called the America First Committee in order to block further aid to Britain. So again, you have this group, this America First Committee. It's people who are like, they're only concerned about America. They're not concerned about any other country or helping any other country. So at its height, this committee or this organization has 800,000 members, including Charles Lindbergh. He's famous for making the first transatlantic flight. And again, this group is designed to keep the United States out of war. And then in November of 1940, Roosevelt won re-election to a third term as president. And in also that same month, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, writes a letter to Roosevelt confessing that the country was bankrupt. It could no longer be able to pay cash for weapons. Roosevelt tried to persuade Congress and the American people at this point to lend aid to Britain. Okay, let them borrow from the United States. And he explains to Americans, the quote that he uses is, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him a hose. You lend it to him and you take it back after the fire is out. The America First Committee obviously is very opposed to this. They campaign strongly against new aid to Britain, but Congress will pass it anyway. And this will become known as the Lend-Lease Act. Okay, and the Lend-Lease Act is going to authorize the president to give aid to any country whose defense was vital to U.S. security. Having Great Britain and France remain free was vital to U.S. security, so they could lend money to them. When Hitler later attacks the Soviet Union, the United States even lends the Soviet Union aid, which is kind of contradictory because the Soviet Union is communist and the United States is very anti-communist. And by the end of the war, the United States will have loaned or given away more than $49 billion worth of aid to 40 different nations.